Hello, everybody. This right here represents the project that this color study comes from. It's the portraiture concepts, like classical portraiture concepts. It goes from drawing to grisaille to color. And then this is the project we're going to be working on today. This is going to be, yeah, here I am. This is going to be the painting that we're going to make today. It's going to be a really short sketch. Probably the whole thing took me about 3.5, maybe 4 hours. And you're going to see that a few places sort of throughout the stream where it kind of skips ahead about 10 or 20 minutes. I tried to, pack it all into as tight a package as I possibly could. So the entire video is about 2 hours and 15 minutes long. In just a moment, I'm going to start talking you through the materials that I'm using, the linen that I'm painting on, like all the stuff that you need to know about what this project is in order to kind of get into it. But real quick off the top, let me just mention that the questions and comments that you have, if you're watching on YouTube right now, if you go to the Proko site, and let me just put this overlay in here. Yeah, go to proko.com/539 if you have questions to ask that you'd like to have me answer during the stream. And also just know that one of the people sorry, let me say it again. One of the people asking a question on proko.com/539 is going to be announced near the end of the stream to be a winner of the entire lesson. So all the way from drawing to grisaille to color painting, you're going to get free access to that lesson. But that's only for people that comment or question on proko.com/539. This also, by the way, is a lesson that I made, I think, sometime last year, just before Proko 2.0 kind of launched. We got it up onto the site, and I think is it just today or whatever? I don't know. Yeah, today only. There's a 25% off like that lesson. So if you were thinking about it, probably now is like a good time. But we'll come back to all that later. I just want to get on top of this so that you know what's going on in this video. So this is going to be an oil painting. It's on a linen. Well, it's an oil primed linen that is actually adhered to a birch panel. And it's adhered with a pH neutral, heat activated adhesive called Beva film. Not that any of you really want to know all that stuff, but substrates are important for oil painters. The paints that I'm using are ivory black on the left, then going to the right, it's alizarin crimson. It is vermilion extra, which is an Old Holland color that actually it's not genuine vermilion, although I'm not actually even sure where you would get true genuine vermilion nowadays, because it kind of contains mercury and all sorts of dangerous. So this is Old Holland's kind of answer to the need for a good vermilion pigment. Then the next one is actually the one that I get the most questions about, right? So usually on a palette like this, which is, I would say, relatively limited, you'd find somebody using like a yellow ochre. That's what I used when I was a student, was yellow ochre. But if that's a pigment that you're familiar with, you know that a lot of yellow ochres are really, really different, and many of them have a very low tinting strength. Like tinting strength basically in oil paint just means if you took 50-50 with, say, your lead white and your yellow ochre, like how strong would it change the lead white? And yellow ochre has a very low tinting strength. This is actually a pigment called yellow brown, which is I think it's a lake color. So it's a dye-based pigment where they've taken like a yellow dye and attached that to opaque pigment granules and then milled that so you kind of make a paint out of it. So it's like a really strong, transparent yellow ochre. It's really nice color. And then I use a flake white, which is a lead-based white, and it has also a very kind of low tinting strength in a way, lower than like titanium, which like a lot of people use titanium. I used to use titanium white, but eventually I kind of found some inconsistencies with it in the performance of it. So maybe 3 or 4 years ago, I just stopped using titanium white kind of altogether. Let me just get a sip of water here. Right, so what is the point of this section of the lesson, right? Like why why do color studies? Why do paintings like this? Why paint so quickly when I'm going to already go through like 3 stages to make a project? Like I said, going through a graphite drawing that's all the way rendered and refined, to a grisaille painting that is taken the same distance, and then into a color painting. Why do you need this little preparation? I view these exercises as more a kind of collection for my visual memory, right? So we all know the situation where when you're in the middle of an oil painting and you're trying to find the kind of color harmonies that are going to make everything kind of hold together, make everything work from just a kind of a value, hue, and chroma perspective. I find that these exercises in the beginning are kind of a consequence-free zone for me to kind of experiment with how these things can kind of hold together. Whether or not I need to like add something to my palette in order to get a real effect to come out of it. Like you'll find paintings and problems within paintings, like in this one, for instance, the red of her hair. Am I going to be able to get that as light and as chromatic as I want it to be with the palette that I have? Maybe I am, maybe not. Tests like these are a great way to kind of get a hold of that. Another thing that I'm kind of testing out here is the kind of parameters of warm and cool. Let me just, by the way, I just want to check and see that all my audio is doing fine. I think that it is. If it's not, somebody will let me know, and then we'll just get on with it. But I think we're doing just fine. So I'm testing out the kind of parameters of what is warm and what is cool in this model's flesh tones. Like a lot of times we're going to look at an area like, say, like the side of her cheek here, or maybe one of the receding planes on her forehead. We're going to search for, say, an area that is cooler in temperature than some other area, so that we can understand like the spectrum of warm and cool available to us in this portrait. Now, like when I look at the source image that's over here, I mean, overall, it's relatively warm. I mean, you'd be hard-pressed to maybe find something particularly cool. But by the way, I also should unpack a little bit. What do we mean when we're saying warm and cool? On a color wheel, you have blue and orange that are kind of diametrically opposed to each other. They're across from each other. They're complementary colors, right? So blue is essentially a cool temperature, and orange is essentially a warm temperature. So when we're saying something is cooler or warmer, we're just referring to the proximity that color is to orange or blue on the color wheel. Now, most flesh tones are, in general, warm. So we're not going to find necessarily, like certainly in this image, we're not going to find, say, like something that is all the way tilted over towards blue, or even on that side of the color wheel. It's all those flesh tones are going to be in a wedge on this warm side of the color wheel. But what I want to know is like, how far do we go towards being a cool temperature? And then what's necessary on that warm spectrum to kind of make it like seem nice and warm and fleshy. Let me real quick also talk about the process that you're seeing like on the screen right now. So I've got basically my white linen panel. I haven't put any preparation onto that. This is partially just because I want to work with colors that are going to be kind of bright enough. So when I have the white of the canvas to compete with, I feel like it keeps my color values as light as they need to be. And I'm just trying to basically like fill the canvas with a generic head-like shape, right? Which is to say, like, I want the simplest possible expression of the subject. And in the case of a sketch like this, it might seem like we're going to be pretty flat, but even from the initial moments, I want to establish like basically the large planes of the head. So if you've ever seen like these planar simplifications, like the John Asaro head, or some of the planar heads that are out there. I'm developing one. I think like probably every artist who's a teacher eventually has some version of the planar head that they would prefer their own kind of a simplification. But if you've ever seen those, basically this is my kind of goal when I'm blocking in a head, is just to get to a place where we have something that is proportionally believable, right? So the kind of size of it, height versus width. It's kind of got that ovoid shape, that classic ovoid shape of the head. But that also I don't want to just work in like flat values. So I think a lot of times when we have a really fast block in, we do like the light shape, shadow shape, and they're kind of like these polarized values just kind of jammed up against each other. That's not something that I want to engage in. I want a head that has like a clear sense of volume to it already. So that means like areas like the side plane of the cheek that you're seeing over here on the left, this is me like pushing that value down to kind of turn that plane away from the light source and adding in those higher key planes like on the side plane of the forehead and on the kind of front corner of the forehead on the left. This is me kind of pulling out highlights to bring up that little bit of sense of dimensionality in the head early on in the study. This is partially because I'm not actually going to be doing almost any measuring. In fact, like thinking back on when I was painting this project, thinking about the speed at which I painted it, I don't think I did much of any measuring. I was really just kind of eyeballing it and looking back and forth. But in order to do that, in order to like make effective, efficient, like eyeballing type choices, what you have to do is get a painting that resembles enough the subject that you can actually compare the two, right? Something I tell students that I work with all the time is that there are kind of two ways that you can look at the world when you're painting. You can look at it, or you can make basically academic observations. So you can make measurements if you're familiar with, say, comparative measuring or sight size. These are academic ways to observe nature and kind of derive proportions from it. And they're very effective, but also they're a little bit time consuming. You have to kind of get into the process of them. If you're intending to paint really, really fast, a lot of times you want to be using the other side of it, which is what I refer to as naive observations, which is to say that we all have a very basic visual memory. Nobody out there watching the stream, except for maybe people that have that weird disorder where they don't have like face memory, they don't recognize people's faces. Everybody else is going to have an innate sense of like visual memory. Like the first time that you saw Stan's face on a video, the next time you saw it, you recognized Stan. You said, oh, that's the same guy that I saw in the previous video. Not because you took a measurement of the proportions of his head or you compared one value to another value, but because you have a naive sense of recognition and visual memory for the proportions that equal that. And in fact, like if in the next video where you saw him, he had gained like 100 pounds and his face was way wider, you would even recognize that difference, right? You would recognize that, oh, in the previous video, his cheeks were like flatter, more sunken, and then in this next video, like his cheeks are really round and like full, right? So our naive memory really shouldn't be underestimated, and that's why, you know, working with good color and good value really early on, just basically in a block-in like this, can be so effective, right? It's because we have that toolkit. Now, having both obviously, I think makes you the strongest painter. But in this one, a lot of what I'm doing is just based on me trying to flash my eyes back and forth between the subject that I'm working from and the painting that I'm working on, and trying to make sense of it through that. And also, by the way, of course, some stored up knowledge of the construction and proportion of the head. So that's basically what this block-in is trying to do. It's just trying to get something on there that looks enough like her that I can kind of flash my eyes back and forth. There's a lot of design to be done, like a lot of drawing to be done. So I need to, you know, find the length of the nose, the width of the forehead. You know, there's a little bit of a foreshortening in this pose. So like her head is kind of tilted up and you're seeing kind of that bottom plane of the nose. That's bringing the kind of the central cartilages of the nose coming up really close to kind of the eye level in that foreshortened way that you get when a head kind of turns up like that. So there's a lot of little considerations that I need to do. But at the same time, right, and this is where that kind of classic juggling metaphor comes in, right, where painting is kind of like having all the juggling balls like up in the air at the same time. You know, you have hue, which is basically the color of something. Is it red? Is it gray? Is it orange? Is it yellow? You have value. Is it light? Is it dark? Is it a mid-tone? And you have chroma. Is it an intense color or a very neutralized color? And then you add on to that, right, another juggling ball that is like the construction of the head, right? So you really have all this stuff kind of going on at once. It's one of the things that I think kind of makes time fly when you're making painting sketches. And if anything, like if nothing else, if there was nothing else that I was going to get out of doing a color study like this, there is that charge of being so busy that you are so in the zone in your painting process that time just just flies off the clock, right? That you are just, you have so many different things to do. Like looking at this painting as I am on my screen right now, the thing that I see is that, oh my gosh, I've got so many different things to do. You know, I'm looking at that, I'm looking at the roundness of the muzzle form and saying, like, from left to right of the mouth, it looks like really, really flat right now. You know, I've got to kind of complete the light shape of the neck. I've got to get the rest of the hair blocked in. You know, even in a very rough way, which I think, you know, it's good to talk about that too, because maybe when we're oil painting or making kind of 2D artwork in general, we can get a little bit caught up in like making things like neat and tidy. You know, like you want to make the perfect color value or the you know, the perfect brush stroke or the perfect shape. And I actually find that in some ways, at like an early stage of the painting, especially when you're making like a sketch, that can get in your way a little bit. I think that there's a certain level of like cultivated messiness that's actually really, really useful to you, right? Because when you have this beautiful pristine surface, there's almost that sense of like you don't want to mess it up. But what I want right now is I want to create, or I want to cultivate a space where I can attack it in any place at any time. Remember, all I know about the color values right now is what my first kind of glance has told me. And I really need to like go into the lab and like test out that hypothesis. So I need for that a surface that kind of wants me to kind of get in there and kind of work with it, right? And I find that actually these kind of rough surfaces, like you're seeing in the application of the shadow right now, you know, that bit of kind of white sticking through, for me, that's like a roughly blocked in shadow in charcoal, you know? Whereas maybe in oil paint, like I said, we get the feeling that because we're painting something, we should fill it in all evenly and everything. But I'm not sure if that exactly tracks. I don't actually like that, you know, at this moment of the painting. But let me go ahead, by the way, and just grab the first question off Proko.com, and I'm going to read that out and just see where it takes us. Let me just grab a drink here while I'm doing it. All right. Norse Hero is asking here, I decided to make an oil painting every Saturday. This last Saturday, my painting turned out really bad. It took the whole day, he says parenthetically. I hate it with passion. It's Tuesday and I'm still distressed about it. How do you deal with bad paintings? Man, and you know, we have all completely and totally been there. Like I went to a 3-year atelier program in Florence, and I spent 4 years there as a student. I took a 4th year, partly because I had the opportunity to do so, but also because even 3 years is a short time to figure out all the stuff that you need to do to be a consistently performing professional painter, right? Like when I think, by the way, of professional painters, I think you should be able to show up, adapt to the circumstances, and deliver not just a result, but you need to deliver a superlative result, right? Like artwork has, at least in the professional realm, has only a little bit of space for average work being delivered. So if someone is commissioning you to do a painting, or you have several paintings to do for an exhibition, making them average is not the goal. That's completely contrary to the goal. So to get to that place where you can perform on that level, it takes a long time. It took me, quite honestly, like longer than 4 years. After 4 years of study, I was technically a professional. I was showing at a gallery or two here and there, and sure, I was selling a bit of my work. Not much at the time, believe me. But I was still like kind of fraught with a lack of consistency. Sometimes, you know, if all things lined up in the right way, it would be great. And if, you know, something was off, it was way off. And that painting just went in the bin. In fact, probably for the first several years of my career, I would wager to say that I put more paintings in the bin than I did into frames. And that's not an exaggeration. I'm not telling it to soften a blow to anybody who's having a tough time. It's just fact. I had really high standards, and I had probably a bit of a perfectionist gene as well, that I had to sort out on my own time. But that meant I had a lot of these bad paintings that would distress me. Coming home from the studio, I would be bummed out. I would be all in my head about it, like not really living my life at home because I was, still so kind of wrapped up in being at the studio and the problems that I was having there. I don't know. I kind of tend to think about it like teenage heartbreak. The classic story that when you first start dating somebody or you first fall in love, it's like it's the most intense thing ever. And you can't imagine that anybody else has ever felt something so intensely as you have, and that then you grow up and you grow older, and hopefully, by the way, maybe you have experienced love several times in your life. I hope that all of you do. But you gain a little bit of a sense of perspective about it, right? That teenage love was an infatuation, and it was fine. It was great at the time, but really it was something very simple. I'm not treading on any weird territory here, but what I want to say is I think painting is a little bit like that too. When you are young in painting, it seems like every painting is like the only painting that you'll ever make, and it's got to be the best one that you ever made. And I don't think that you ever totally get over being a bit bummed out by it, but you gain that sense of perspective that you're going to show up the next day and you're going to do something different, and you're going to get a different result. And on top of which, as you grow and mature in your skill and in your understanding of how the process works, you're going to become more consistent. You're going to have less of those days where you pursued a project that was outside your means, and you colossally did not arrive at a good result. So yeah, I mean, that's the good news is like the only thing I think you can do is really keep painting and keep struggling, and get better at what you're doing to eliminate that. I don't think the elimination comes from any secret philosophy or anything else. It just comes with maturity. Not necessarily as a person, but as an artist, right? Like I said, I feel like there's kind of parallel tracks that we mature as people naturally as we grow older, but also we mature as artists. I started my journey as a representational artist when I was I would say when I was 24, because basically that's when I started being educated to do it. Previous to that, I wanted to paint stuff that looked like stuff, but I didn't know at all where to start. So, those first couple of years at the academy, it was a lot of failing forward. I did a lot of drawings that didn't arrive. I did plenty of paintings that I'm happy to not be able to look back on. But you grow up and you get 100 paintings under your belt, and that painting that you made on Saturday and still bothering you on Tuesday, it just doesn't happen as often. So where we are in the painting right now, we're about 24 minutes into painting. Now, one of the things I want to mention about these sketches that is really important is you want to fill up the canvas basically as quickly as you can. Now, there's both parts of that statement that are quite true, in that, by the way, you're seeing my hand and the brush going on the frame at slightly different times, but my mistake. What I wanted to say was it's important to fill the canvas as quickly as possible, hopefully as accurately as possible. I strike that. Take accuracy out of that. But we say as quickly as possible, but what we mean really is that if you cannot fill it in an orderly way, then it's not possible. So we're going to, in the most orderly way possible, fill the canvas so that we get what I would call a completed context for the colors and values that we're searching for, right? So if we look at the source image that is right here, you see that mostly it's a very dark source image with one kind of primary light shape that comes out of the middle. I want to get my canvas to have that effect kind of as soon as possible, because that's the point at which I really start making good decisions. By the way, you also just noticed, like on the stream or on the video, that the palette was kind of cleansed. This was actually the first session finished. So I think the first session actually was just maybe 30 minutes of blocking in. And that eventually, the next day, I went through and finished. I think it was probably just a time issue. But now I'm going to work on, trying to get everything kind of filled in so that I have a good context to kind of paint. And also, the other thing about it as well, and I think I remember this distinctly from painting on this project, because this is an oil ground, the paint doesn't grab on the surface in a totally opaque way. Like if you're an oil painter and you've ever blocked in a painting on one day on a white canvas, you understand that you don't really get a full true color on that, like a fully true opaque color, unless you're maybe using your palette knife to get it on there. And so I remember kind of strategically blocking in for 30 minutes just to get something on the canvas, and then coming back, because then I knew I'd be able to get kind of nice opaque color to kind of work on. But what I'm doing now, right, is just kind of trying to reestablish a little bit the drawing. I mean, there's so many things in this about the design, which is to say I use kind of drawing and design a little bit interchangeably. There's a story behind that, but maybe it's for another time. For now, we just say that I'm working on the design of the face and trying to use these kind of darker hatch marks to push a shape in this way or push it up that way, or basically kind of create the information that will allow me to kind of cross-reference, one feature to the next feature. But I did digress. I want to go back to filling the canvas, why that's important, and that goes back also to maybe what I was saying kind of at the beginning of the stream, which was, wait a minute, what was I saying at the beginning of the stream? Naive observations. I was talking about naive observations, and those naive observations are only possible when we have something recognizable. So one of the things that also happens a lot when students are working with color is they start to make color choices a little bit too early. Now, let me explain this in the clearest way possible. Naturally, when I'm putting something on the canvas, there's a kind of color choice taking place. But in order to have like an informed choice, I need to get rid of that white of the canvas, because that white is not a part of the context on this dark picture that we're looking at here. So until I really fill up the canvas, I don't actually have the possibility to make necessarily all that good of choices. By the way, you're watching me do something here on the canvas now that I think is a really nice practice. It's something you'll see me do later in this course as well when we get to the grisaille section. But starting a fresh painting day, I want to try as much as possible to keep my color and value as light as I can, so that I don't like kind of compress my value scale in the painting. So what happens a lot is when we're oil painting, we tend to like paint our values down because we start looking at all the color that we're seeing. And what happens when you add color to a white pigment, right? So if you just look at the yellow brown and you look at the vermilion and you look at the alizarin crimson, all those colors on my palette are darker in value than the lead white. Like, of course they are, because white is the top of the value scale, but they're darker. So if I add those pigments to my lead white, what's going to happen is that it's going to diminish in its value. It's going to get darker in its value. So the more color that we're adding, the more chroma that we're adding to the white, the darker it gets. But in order to get a really great bold light effect, we need to keep our lights as light as possible. So one of the things that I do to try and kind of keep my value scale up is to, when I'm kind of reestablishing the painting, I like to key up a little bit the values just by scumbling a really light value over the dried surface. So this pushes the value scale in the lightest areas up just a little bit. Then by the time we get through the painting and I'm darkening it down a little bit, then I have darkened it down from a level that is high enough that it doesn't get to be like a dark and kind of muddy, dingy looking painting. So why don't we take another question here. Fabio Simioli says, what was the most important skill to learn as a student, and how did you approach learning painting that allowed you to get to a point like this? Also, how much did you study a day? So there's like 3 questions in there from Fabio. And why don't we start with the most important skill to learn as a student? All right, and this is classic curveball answer. I think the most important skill to learn as a student is a consistent application of your attention, right? I'm a person that runs like really hot and cold. And so some days I would be so on fire to be working. I would be so dead focused as a student, like you couldn't get me away from my easel. I was just on fire to be working. Other days I was distracted, or I was tired, or I was this, or I was that. I was a million different things. But while you can't necessarily like totally change your own nature, and like, yeah, I'm not prescribing that you go get self-help to be a better art student, but what I'm saying is this: you will benefit a lot from maintaining a consistent schedule in your practice and in your study. This means basically that you're applying yourself an equal amount each day that you kind of come into the studio. That is how you take, in the long term, big leaps forward, right? Those leaps don't happen in the one day when you're super on fire, excited. That's just one day of work. You need to put in the consistent hours. So I would say consistency maybe is the most important skill to learn as a representational painting student. The next part of that would be, how did you approach learning painting that allowed you to get to a point like this? I approached it... I have the tendency to maybe answer these questions in a way that's a little bit unfair to myself. I would say that looking back, knowing what I know now, I approached it a bit like a bull in a china shop. Like I just knew that there was this stuff, and I knew that I had to work hard enough to kind of get a hold of it. If I knew then what I know now, I would have listened so much more to the instructors that I had. Even if like some of them I didn't get along with, I should have still wanted what they knew, and just, put whatever feelings I had about working with them aside. So how did I do it? I just, I just put my entire life into it, frankly. I mean, I moved to Florence when I was 24. And previous to that, I'd just been living in my studio in a small studio south of Miami. And very small studio. And I was just there. That's all I was going to do. I mean, not to over dramatize it, but I love that movie Gattaca, and when Ethan Hawke is talking about like how he won the race against his genetically superior brother, a swimming race. He said that he just didn't save anything for the swim back. Like that was kind of what I did to kind of get to where I was going. And I'm not saying it was wise or it was smart or it was something everybody should do, but it's what I did, or what seemed to make sense to me at the time. But I do feel like you kind of need to be as all in as you can be. I do think that if you have like a fallback, this is turning into bad advice, but I'm going to give it anyway. If you have like a fallback, it's really easy to fall back on. I didn't have that. Like I had to, it was going to be this or nothing. So I don't know. Take that advice with an enormous grain of salt. Let's see. The last part of the question was, how much did you study a day? So school started at 9 a.m. and then ended at 4 p.m. And then you had evening drawing. That was a class from 5 to 7 p.m. And you had figure drawing 2 nights a week. And then you had anatomy 1 night a week. And then you had an art history lecture on another night a week. So you had 1 evening a week off. So on every day except for Thursday, you had 6 hours. No, you had 8 hours of classes. The first 6 hours being like all drawing or all painting. So it's 2 3-hour studio courses. So I did that for about 4 years. And like I said, I still feel like there was a lot to learn after that. But that's just me. I'm very, I just feel like I've always felt like there was a really high ceiling on what I could learn. And so, I mean, I just thought I'm just going to keep at it until I feel like I can't improve anymore. And I still haven't reached that day yet. So here we are. By the way, just to mention, the painting is finally getting a little bit filled up. I think pretty soon you're gonna see me wrap around that background. But I would say at this moment we have like a head that we can kind of look at. There's also a diversity of color value if you look at it. In the beginning of this live stream, I talked about warm and cool temperatures, and we want to say that that's like relative within the flesh, right? I was talking about this color wheel where there's like kind of blue and orange, and that all your color values are going to be on that orange side essentially, right? But we're going to have some that are closer to blue. If you look at the side plane of her cheek here, just next to her ear, you have a great juxtaposition of two temperatures there that are warm and then cool. So the ear is a very warm orange, and then the color that is next to that, right, directly to the right of the ear, is a little bit cooler. Now, it looks cool. It looks like a gray, like a cool gray in this very warm context. But if we had like if you put that color value that's on her cheek right here, if you put that on like my shirt here, right, in this blue, in this super cold context, it's a warm gray. So this is part of what you're kind of dealing with, is trying to see what cool temperatures will fit into your warm context. And by the way, like that, more than anything, not more than anything, more than almost everything, is how you get to like realistic flesh tones. If your flesh tones are either all warm or all cool, they're not going to look fleshy, right? Because if you look at like my hand here, which the light doesn't really show it, but we can see like warmth in my hand here. And if you go down my arm here, we have cooler temperatures here, right? Skin is all about finding that variety in the temperature. It's not just about, 4 great warm flesh colors. It's about where the cools that kind of complement those, and thus make the painting feel like it has this kind of flesh tone type effect. Let's get to the next question, because I think quite a few of them have come in. But let's see. Carlos Polit says, hi. I know there are different approaches to laying in a portrait, more classical ones, Riley, Loomis, etc. But how do I lay in a real portrait from life? If light is changing every time and my model gets tired, do I have to measure regularly? Because it tends to change the position a little bit, and so how could I approach it? Thanks. So it's an interesting question, and I'll just say, like, my primary training for those 4 years was all drawing and painting from life, and so there's a particular set of challenges that you have when drawing and painting from life. One of them that you bring up, of course, is that the model does kind of change and move. I mean, they're human, right? So if you're standing up on and putting your weight on one leg for 3 hours, and in 25-minute segments, by the end of those 3 hours, your leg is going to be really in pain, and you're going to have shifted your weight a little bit to the other leg. And this is very common for life models. Even if you're sitting down, you can get stiff and you can need to kind of move around. So part of the joy of like working from life is also part of the curse of working from life, is that you have a portrait in front of you that will be inconsistently represented. What you have to do is understand very well the construction of the head, because on your paper or on your canvas, you are creating a reality unto itself, right? If you literally just followed everything that the model did when the model stood up there or sat in the chair, and in one moment she's looking like this, and another like this, and another like that, and another like this, you'll never come to a result. But what you do have, right, is there's a course, for instance, that I teach. It's on my Patreon. It's been on there for probably a year now. But it's a course on centerline construction, which is basically the process that I go through building up the head from scratch, so that you start with the kind of anatomical centerline of the face and search for structures that move outward from that centerline towards the contours of the face. What this does is basically sets up a wireframe of the head that you can understand really from any direction. So the early part of your drawing or your painting, in a way, you're working on something that is a little bit abstract. It's kind of an idealized version of the subject, right? If you look at like a Loomis head, which, by the way, my centerline construction, it's not, I wouldn't say it's a world of different from Loomis. There's probably elements that you'll see that are going to be in common. There's other things that I do that are different, in particular to how I work. But I think, like I said, I think every artist who does some kind of constructive method will have added their own 2 cents to any of those methods that they use. But I think that is pretty much essential to understanding like how to work from life, because you just can't rely on copying what you see. You'll never see the same thing. So you create a logical structure for the head on the paper to start with. From there, you take the details from the model that are relevant to the structure that you have set. Now, if your structure is poor, you'll have to be changing that structure throughout as you go forward, trying to get to a conclusion. If your structure is really good and really well studied, you should be able to turn it into your model with relative ease. So I think that what I would recommend to you if you're working from life and you really needed to figure out like how to approach the head is you need to do many block-ins of the head. So not fully developed drawings, but many, maybe 30-minute, maybe 1 hour head block-ins. So you're not going to get into the values and the look in the model's eye or the little corner of the mouth that makes the expression. You're going to get into developing a believable structural three-dimensional head. I would recommend it to be in kind of linear wireframe. Perhaps use a value or two to indicate a couple of planes. But overall, simplified heads, and many of them, are the best way to get used to how you're going to have to adapt to a moving model. Right. So one of the things maybe interesting to mention about the painting, what I'm doing now, is I'm trying to, like, we look at the forehead. I'm trying to establish like the basic planes of the forehead. Now, planes are a really super specific way that artists will talk about things that look round, right? Anything that appears to have like volume appears to have planes in a sense. If you think about that basic sort of cube, right, that you can draw, that's just showing like 3 sides of a cube, and then each one will be kind of a different value to indicate the direction that the light is coming from. That forehead is going to be really very much the same. So we have that broad central plane, that's one value. We have a plane on the right hand side which is a little bit darker, and we have one on the left hand side which carries the highest key light and the highlight, or the nominal highlight as well, right? So if we don't have those 3 values, the forehead will be flat, right? So this is an important thing to remember, by the way. Anything that has that sense of form, the sense of volume or roundness, right, has planes. Now, something I hear from students all the time is that I don't know how to see the planes, or I don't know how to see the value shapes. How do I see shapes? I think that there's a few different things happening in that moment when we're trying to figure that out. One of which is that actually we do all see them. And there's no different way that I see with my eyes ahead. Because if my face, for instance, if my face to you looks round, then you are seeing planes. You're seeing the evidence of planes. It's just connecting that together with what I talked about also earlier, which was what's the simplest possible expression of the subject, right? So how do you express a nose just using 4 planes? But if you look at my nose, there's hundreds of planes, hundreds of little facets and planes that turn and create a very specific set of volumes that make me look like I do. But you need to go more basic. You just see, like, if the forehead is round, identify the lightest light, identify the darkest dark, which is going to be down here in the hair, and then compare the values that move across it. Being aware that what you're trying to do is establish broad, simplified planes of color and value that are going to give you the most basic sense of form. And that's, like I said, that's what's happening in this right now. I'm also trying to juggle as well, at the same time, getting a good visual impression. So if you see me actually sometimes probably looking at the screen, one of the things that I'm doing is I'm squinting down, right? I'll squint down, I'll kind of look at the screen a little bit. What I'm doing is kind of reducing a little bit the amount of light that kind of comes into my eye. It's a tool actually that, frankly, I use constantly. I think most painters that I know, like most professionals that I know, we understand to constantly kind of squint down to look at your painting to test the values. So what squinting down does is a couple things. One, it kind of blurs a little bit your vision, so it takes away any of like the surface detail, and it also tends to compress a little bit the darks. And so I'm looking, when I squint down and look at something, it's to see a little bit more clearly the values. Now, interesting thing happening, notable, that as we are 46 minutes in to this painting, or actually we're probably more than 46 minutes because we've already passed by a 20-minute skip in time. So we're about overall like probably an hour into the painting. I've just now started to indicate the eyes. This is because I'm doing my best to paint the entire head. And only at this point do I think it has become necessary for me to put the eyes in order to kind of progress forward. And this is very much in keeping with, sorry, just 1 second. This is very much in keeping with my kind of philosophy about kind of progressing through a drawing or through a painting, is I try not to add new information until I kind of need to. Or you could alternatively say, until I've run out of stuff to do in that previous stage, right? So I've done as much work as I felt like I could without the eyes. And now I've added them in to make the painting a little bit more complex and to give myself more kind of work to do. Real talk, I could probably, I'm looking at it now, I still see there's things I could do. I think that putting the eyes in with having addressed the light shape of the neck as little as I have, maybe I proceeded a little bit too fast, but that's also maybe instructive in the sense that, you know, all these great stages that you see and like all the great diagrammatic, you know, suggestions of how to progress through a painting or a drawing, no matter how great they are, one of the things that they're doing is just giving you a hypothetical to say your drawing or painting could look like this at this stage. Or alternatively, you could say that they are representing an idea, right? So if you wanted to show somebody how to work with shadow and light, you know, you'd make a stage that looked a particular way. It doesn't mean that every drawing or painting has to go through that stage, or that you always have to progress only with the things that are absolutely necessary to progress. Maybe that's a little bit too strict of a way to kind of go about doing things. So you can pick and choose what makes sense to you. And I think, by the way, also, because I know all of you out there, you're painting students, you're trying to figure out how to do all this stuff on your own as well. Understand that you've got to kind of pick and choose a little bit as well, which is to say that I think as teachers, you know, well, I mean, as teachers, as artists, right? Like I'm a painter myself. I don't only teach. Like when I'm not teaching, I'm just making my own work. But we're driven by our interests. You know, I think one of the easiest ways to describe it is to talk about like anatomy, right? To say that I think different artists have an enthusiasm for anatomy that extends to a slightly different place. You know, I was really, I say was, maybe I was, or still am, very enthusiastic about anatomy. I mean, to the extent that I taught it for 6 years. I taught écorché for 4 or 5 years. So, I mean, it was something that for me really unlocked like a lot of stuff that I was struggling with was solvable, you know, with that knowledge, that skill set. However, I stop at analyzing or interacting with cadavers. I never wanted to cut anybody up. I never wanted to see the actual physical dead tendons. That was where my enthusiasm topped out, right? Hit the glass ceiling. Everything before that, I'm super excited about. Everything Richet ever did, everything Goldfinger did. Those were the people I really wanted to kind of dive deep on and learn from. So, absolutely tons of enthusiasm. However, there are artists who are so interested that they do go and they go to medical, facilities, and some of them are even, like, I think Dan Thompson's even out there. with whatever scalpels and stuff, cutting things up. I mean, it's an incredible dedication and incredible knowledge that he's deriving from that. Suffice to say, right, getting to my point after like all this preamble, we all have parts of the story, and those parts are driven by our interests, right? So when you look at my work, you can see that quite clearly I'm into drawing, quite clearly I'm into painting, I'm into structure and anatomy and design and flat shapes versus form and like all this other stuff I'm into, right? But like there's a limitation in that. I'm not into everything about painting. So when you're a student and you're out there kind of searching for what you want to study, you kind of need to be guided a little bit by your tastes. And this is not to say that you should just dip your toe in every single pool that's available out there, because I think if you scatter yourself that much, you risk to become, excuse me, you risk to become like okay at everything and not really great at anything. But you need to be guided a little bit by your taste and search for like what the aptitudes of that teacher are and try to gain those things from that artist. I forget where we started, but that's where we're ending up. Let me go ahead and take another question. Praneet Aki says, what's the best source to study facial anatomy of muscles that create a variety of expressions? There is a great series of books from a company, I think the company is called Anatomy for Sculptors, or at least the series of books is called Anatomy for Sculptors. But they have a whole diagrammatic book with deep explanation on facial expressions. I would also recommend Goldfinger's Artistic Anatomy, because when he goes into each muscle, he also describes those muscle actions and what that tends to do to the kind of morphology, right? So when a muscle contracts, not all of them bulge in exactly the same way because there are different muscle structure types. And Goldfinger goes into that in depth. So I would recommend those two sources. I think, as with sources and references like this, the more the merrier. So don't go one or the other, but get both for sure. Let's see. Jonas Sanders says, how valuable to you was sight size training using the Barg plates? I know a lot of successful artists who never trained with them. Would you say Barg drawing was essential to your progression? Jonah, it's a cool question. I think that I did go through the Barg process or the Barg program, and I did so using sight size. So it would not really be possible for me to say what would have happened if I hadn't done that. I think that they're a very good way to go through it. That the way that I think about Bargs in general, and I just wrapped up the Barg section in the what I'm calling the Atelier tier on my Patreon. So I'm kind of taking my Patreon subscribers through everything I did at the Academy, but I'm also arranging the curriculum in a way that I would have done knowing what I know now. So that's the Atelier tier at Stephen Bauman Artwork, or patreon.com/Stephen Bauman Artwork. If that's what you're into, like I said, I just wrapped up the Belvedere Torso, so the Barg course is ending. The cast program is beginning. I don't use sight size actually in that class. And the reason I don't use it is because, of course, I don't really intend to use it in the rest of the curriculum. Sight size is something that is really great and really cool, but it also makes certain requirements that I don't think are so suited to online students. It's not that they can't have it, but you really need space to exercise sight size. Also, just the learning of sight size itself is its own kind of skill. You need to practice a lot to get good at sight size and to be able to kind of integrate sight size effectively into your process. Yeah, it's almost like students that are coming into the academy, they spend their first term just figuring out sight size, hopefully, right? And some of them, in their second term, they're still figuring out the mechanics of how measuring can affect your work and how it can affect your ability to kind of become accurate. That being said, it's a highly demanding tool, but it's a very good one. The best thing about it is that your subject and your drawing or your painting, there's nowhere to hide in between them, right? Sight size is putting either visually or physically your subject directly next to your work. So if there are discrepancies, there's no way for you to look intently at the subject and then look completely away and down at your drawing board and kind of escape what the subject looks like. You're there and you're kind of flashing your eyes back and forth in between the two, and you even get this visual phenomenon where things will jump, right? So if I'm properly observing in sight size to a drawing and a subject, I'm flashing my eyes back and forth, and let's say, like, you know, one of them is a little bit lower, I'm gonna catch that instantly just by virtue of the sight size arrangement. So there's a lot of cool stuff to be said from it. You know, as I hear a lot on the internet, there seems to be, like, you know, plenty of people who don't like sight size, and I think that's fine too. I don't know, if you don't like sight size, then I don't think you should use it at all. But I can say that, you know, I spent 4 years, you know, or more painting in sight size, and I didn't experience any negative effects from it. You know, it's just, like I said, it's time consuming. It's rigorous to figure out the mechanics of how it actually works. You know, it feels at first like a little bit non-intuitive, but as time goes on, you start to understand the value of it. And like I said, there's some things that it just sorts out really easily. Like flat shape design is really, really, really super easy in sight size. So for all the things that it isn't, there's also things that it is as well. Now, to be fair to your question also, and answer, like, do I feel like Barg was essential to my process? I feel like it was useful to my process. And what Bargs do, they're basically kind of a conduit, right, between your teacher and your brain. Right, so both of you then are focused in on this image, right, that is organized and orchestrated to show you what nature can be categorized as: shadow shapes, light shapes, halftones, transitions, right, ambient light, you know, contour lines, gesture. All of these subjects that we need to know intimately, they're represented in these Bargs. And so rather than just talking abstractly about line quality or talking abstractly about gesture, I can point to the Bargs, and I can talk to my students and say, listen, this is the line that communicates a sinuous gesture. This is a more structural, kind of straight angle break type line. You know, this is what they communicate. Now, technically, you could take any drawing in the world that was really super proficient and do that with it. The advantage of Barg is that it's an entire, like, coherent course developed specifically for this process of communicating the means of visual expression. So why not take it, almost? If you don't like Bargs and you don't want to work on, like, master copies, then I say, like, totally don't do it. And if you want to have, like, a whole school that doesn't do that, I think that's great too. You know, I mean, there's so much to learn out there. There's nobody to say that you all have to take the same route through it. I think that it was good for my progression overall to go through the Barg program in the way that I did. And yeah, so for me, I think it's a great tool. There's a reason, though, that when I went through school, I did, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, I think I did 5 Barg drawings, 3 in graphite and 2 in charcoal. There's a reason that I only do 2 in the atelier tier on my Patreon. The reason I only do 2 is because I think we can get most of what we need in a slightly more brief period. For whatever reason, at the Florence Academy, it was very Barg focused, very Barg heavy, and some people would take their whole first year doing Bargs. I think it's excessive. But, you know, suffice to say, like, you know, it's an interesting tool the way that I experienced it, but I've even minimized it further because I think it's great. But let's get on to analyzing our own three-dimensional world, making our own kind of choices about kind of light and shadow, where things get a little bit more real, a little bit faster. So the oil painting is progressing. We're probably about an hour and a half into actual painting time. And you can see one of the things that I tried to do, and let's talk a little bit about maybe the way that you're going to paint these studies. You don't want to straight away start chucking in a whole bunch of really opaque pigment, right? A lot of thick paint. Because you're trying to work from the broad to the specific, what we need to do is get the entire head arranged in relatively warm tones, And then once we become confident about that big expression of hue, value, and chroma, we can start to break down into kind of smaller bits. Now, that means that by the time we're at the end trying to analyze these smaller relationships, we don't want a ton of paint on the canvas that we have to kind of fight against, right? If you've ever been oil painting and you have like really thick paint on the canvas, but you have to change the value. Let's say like this area on her cheek here, right? That's really, really light. Let's say that I've made that too light and I need to darken it, right? But what if I've got like, you know, a big palette knife swatch of paint on there? I can't like paint that down. So I'm strategically staying slightly thin, but still opaque with the paint that I'm adding. You should also notice that it's pretty broken up. I'm not doing a ton of like actual smoothing out. Now, I know maybe like depending upon your aesthetic, maybe this looks like I'm smoothing out a lot. For me, this is very rough. And this is what I would consider tiling the values, which is to say like I'm looking for like little small kind of planes of value or color value that give me the sense of the turning of form and the light effect that eventually I'm seeing in this painting. So just remember, like when you're making your own color studies, right, that you need to kind of gauge where you're at in the process at that time. And that's going to go in accordance with like how thick the paint that you're going to add to that is, right? So maybe at the end, I'm going to get like, you know, I'll put a really, you know, thick, you know, brush stroke of light on the specular highlight, or if I feel like it's a really chromatic area where I need to really hit the color really hard, you know, maybe I'm going to want like a really nice, big, thick, opaque brush stroke to do that with. But at this stage, I'm still keeping it kind of relatively thin. It's not washy, mind you, but it's a little bit thinner. I should mention also, I didn't say off the top, and maybe I should have said it back then. I'm using a couple brushes here. Both of them are synthetic brushes. One's a Utrecht, I think it's like a nylon brush. It's a flat. And another one that I'm using is like a Blick Scholastic Wonder White synthetic. It's just a really cheap synthetic filbert brush. I find that they help me kind of scrub paint on without getting too much paint on and without like kind of dragging too much paint away like maybe a hog bristle brush might do. And as far as medium, I'm using almost no medium at all. I think I have a little bit of linseed oil in a cup. I mean, for the last 6 years, probably all I've used as a medium is just a little bit of a few drops of linseed oil in a medium cup on the edge of my palette. I find that, you know, and I went through periods where I was using all sorts of like different exotic mediums. I was using one in particular, I was using Canada Balsam, which is like tree sap basically, right? I was using Canada Balsam, triple rectified turpentine, Demar varnish, and stand oil, all in a concoction as a medium. I can tell you why I had heard there was an artist that I knew that like used this particular medium, and I was like, oh, this is how he paints, so this must be really good. I was trying to get something that wouldn't sink in. If you know about oil painting, then you know about sinking in, that naturally as the paint dries, the oil recedes into kind of lower layers of the substrate, and you get this kind of matte surface. Well, if you're using, you know, something that's, you know, 1/4 like Canada Balsam, 1/4 stand oil, 1/4 Demar, and then I think probably 1/4, maybe a little bit less, something like that, of triple rectified turpentine. That is a glossy medium. It's also not super archival, so I wouldn't necessarily recommend to use it at all. But long story short, you know, I've used every medium on the block, and though some of them are cool, I've just never found them like super necessary. Usually what I would be trying to do with a medium is try to solve a process problem where the process was wrong. Like as a student, for instance, you know, I was working on paintings for 75 hours. So 3 hours a day, 5 days a week, right? And that would be like my figure painting would be 3 hours a day, 5 days a week for 5 weeks. That's a huge problem for oil painting because especially when you're working like I did, kind of broadly all over the whole canvas, your painting never really totally gets a chance to dry. So you're working on this painting that just gets stickier and tackier and weirder, and that by the end of it, usually is a very unpleasant surface to paint on. Now, if you add to that weird mediums, you can get it to where it will dry every day, but then like you're kind of compromising what your painting process is in general, because a big thing about oil painting for professionals, of course, is longevity. Now, if you go pro and you're out there in the world and you're selling paintings and you're doing really great, selling for a lot of money, they need to survive, because you will be more or less responsible for changes in the painting over time that are not related to environment or atmosphere. So things like mold, you might not be responsible for, but things like delamination, where part of the painting would chip off, that collector's going to go to the gallery or go to you and say, hey, the painting that you sold me for really a lot of money, part of it chipped off, or the eye is dripping down the face. These things can really happen when you use weird, crazy, exotic mediums. And it's not a reality that's going to happen in 3 to 5 years. This is going to be 15, 20 years. Actually, there's the famous story, like I'm sure everybody more or less kind of knows. So I'm not breaking any news here, but we all know Ahmed Aldoori, the painter, right? And there was this really big controversy because paintings that he had made at a certain point in time, using a particular kind of medium. The way I understand it, by the way, the facts of this, I might have them a little bit off. So if you're an internet sleuth, go out there and find out what the facts are. I don't remember them totally exactly, but more or less, using some exotic medium, the medium was able to be affected by extreme heat, and that some of the paintings that were in storage in a very hot storage container eventually melted a bit. And so there was this collector that was, well deep in collecting his work, who had all this work that had become damaged due to the manufacture of it. Now, this is a super extreme, dramatic thing. It's the nightmare of professional oil painters, is that something like this will happen. It's probably very difficult to get that to happen. But just to say, one of the reasons that I just use a couple drops of linseed oil in a medium cup is that I know that is not going to let me down. And I'm going to make a painting process for myself that only requires that, right? I don't, by the way, also use any solvents in my painting process. So I don't use any turpentine, white spirits, even my paintbrushes when I'm washing them. I just use a nitrile glove and just a bit of strong dish soap usually, or you can use Murphy's oil soap. These soaps that are meant to basically cut through heavy oil. That should be enough to get 99% of your brush clean. And then after that, it's just kind of taking good care of them, using, not using super hot water, stuff like that can affect the bristles negatively. But wow, what a digression. I've gone really far out on a limb. Real quick, I just want to mention, and I'm going to put this overlay up, just for today, right? If you want to get the course that is associated to this painting, right? So what I showed in the beginning, where I went from a drawing to a grisaille to a full color painting, which is my course on what I'm calling basically classical portraiture, which is essentially going through the appropriate stages to make a painting. If you're interested in that course, you've been thinking about it for a while, today's the day. It's 25% off. And also don't forget, for those of you that are watching this on YouTube, if you go to the website, which is proko.com/539, and ask a question. One of the people that asks a question, whether or not I get to it during the airtime, one of the questioners is going to be gifted an award of free access to that course. So if you're on YouTube right now, jump over to patreon.com to proko.com, ask your question, get in on it. And at the end, I'm going to announce who won that. So in about, we're about an hour and 10 in. So in about 50 minutes, I'm going to announce who that winner is, roughly. And then the code, Bauman25, that's the code to get your 25% off. But right, back to the stream. Hey, finally, I'm getting the background onto the painting. Real talk, if I'm recommending to a student, I'm going to say you should have gotten your background on earlier. as it is, I think it's a fine time to do it. I built up a little bit the context of the painting. I also, to be fair, I've got well over 100 heads under my belt, and some of this stuff I'm kind of prepared for. If I was a little bit less experienced, I would say let's get this background in a lot sooner, because again, it fills up the context of the painting, and that affects the way that you see the color values, right? So now that I'm getting rid of that white, the only brightness left in the painting is going to be the color values that I've chosen within the light of the head. All right. Whew. So let's do some more questions. MJ Artwork, who I know from Patreon, says, "Do you wish you had Proko's team sometimes?" I do, yeah, sure, why not? I mean, he's got like 1,000 people back there working, facilitating all of his schemes. So yeah, of course, who wouldn't want that? Ruben Cabrera asks, how does one know it's the right time to move into color? That is quite an appropriate question for for this course, because as I said, it goes through drawing, grisaille, and then into color. Now, why does it do that? Like, what's a grisaille good for to kind of begin with? Excuse me. What doing a grisaille underneath your full color painting gives you is the confidence that all of your values and hopefully the design of your painting, so the accuracy of it, are nailed on. Now, one of the things that makes painting in color so difficult is that what happens, for instance, when we need to move something in a painting. Let's say that we're looking at the ear on the model, right? Let's say it's this one over here on the left side of the model's head. Let's say I've got that like a full centimeter too low. I gotta move that up. Well, I'm not just moving that shape. I have wet paint interacting with other wet paint. So I've got the deep, deep, deep dark brown purple of her hair versus the much higher key and chromatic orange of her ear. So what happens when you mix those two colors together, right? Basically, you get a kind of muddy gray, a muddy warm gray, which will basically ruin the value and the hue of the shape that I'm painting for the ear. So you can't, with color, like make too many huge jumps in your design, right? Because you'll mess up usually the value and the hue, which are two of the three components that you have to be accurate with in color. So it's hue, value, chroma. By the way, actually, what am I saying? Of course, you'll mess up the chroma as well, because you'll kind of gray it down by kind of mixing things back and forth. If you find consistently that you have really muddy colors, what it usually means is that you're doing too much pushing and mixing like on the canvas. And all these complementary colors, all these warm and cool colors are just getting smushed together until you have this kind of muddy, even gray in between. Over blending also kind of does that when people are doing too much with their brush, kind of tickling the painting a lot. You can also get into a case where you have like really kind of muddy colors. So grisaille painting allows you to understand the drawing, so the design. It allows, so the ear, we're not going to be moving it. We already know where it is. The value, right? Is the ear light? Is it dark? Whatever. Where is it placed? What is the form of it? It sorts out like 2/3 of the questions that you need to answer when you're kind of working on color. And so that, I would say, illustrates a little bit what is a great time to move into color is when you have sorted out drawing, right? So drawing a very good representational head. And then you've sorted out a use of values. I would also say, add to that list familiarity with oil paint, right? So let's say like the trajectory for a student is like this. We learn how to make a shadow shape in graphite, right? So this shadow shape that's on the right side of her face, we learn how to make that shape and make that transition, gradient, even value, technique, all this stuff. We learn how to do that in graphite, and that's great. Now the concept that is making a shadow shape stays the same when you move into oil paint. The actual manufacture of making that shadow shape is totally different. This painting is so much more process driven than what drawing is, right? It has a lot more kind of moving parts. So in a sense, you need to familiarize yourself with the stuff that oil paint will and won't do. And once you've done that, then I think moving into color is great. Now I'm describing this in optimum circumstances. So in a perfect world, when would you progress to color? Once you become proficient in drawing, once you understand value very well, which usually entails probably some early oil studies to experiment with value and value application, and then just how does oil paint work? Color is really, really challenging. It's throwing several more juggling balls up into the air, when you already have a few going. So I think I like to take a kind of stepped approach and make sure I've mastered these other things before I kind of dive into color. That being said, experimenting with color. I mean, go make a painting in color to see what happens. Your first 10 paintings will probably be a disaster anyway. So like, just get them gone, and then that's not a bad thing either. So by the time you're actually working on a project that is useful or that's necessary, that you're going to be a little bit prepared. But it won't happen. Really, it won't come to fruition unless you have like a good sense of drawing. So wow. By the way, let's look at the painting for a minute, right? Let's look at this process. You can see that the tiles of value that I've started to add here have gotten a little bit more complex, meaning you can see the kind of unity. You can see actually even some transitions being created between light and shadow. Like we look at the forehead on the far left-hand side, that highlighted area, which by the way, now that I have that background in, it looks so bright and luminous, right? If I wanted to kind of mess with the process of this stream, I would go back in time and show you what it looked like with that white background. And by the way, if you're watching this after the stream is over, go back, jump back, and look at how that highlight looked with white background all behind her head, and then look at it now, right? Now it is the luminosity. Before, the white of the background was the luminosity, right? And this looked kind of like probably in a sense darker. It's darker than white. It's not pure white on her forehead. But you can see like the progression of color value from lighter, darker, darker, darkest, until on the far right-hand side of the forehead, the color values there, almost when we squint down, they just fade into the shadow, right? This is in a sense a good area of color study, meaning that each passage, like each plane shift, is its own kind of distinct color value, right? You could almost like go through with a color picker and just extract what each one of those color values was and understand like how to make that turn. By the way, don't forget to like go to the left of the highlight, and what do we see? We see also a very light value. This is interesting. Let's do this. This is a contextual problem, right? So if we look at that area to the left of the highlight on her forehead, it's still quite a bright value, right? But we know that it's darker, or we know that it's a darker value because the highlight's standing out. If the highlight did not appear to stand out, that would mean that this area on the left of the highlight was too light. So I painted that down. However, it has to be lighter than all the values on the right-hand side of the forehead. So we go darker, lightest, light, but not quite as light as the kind of lightest. That's how you get a kind of highlight to stand out. All the things that you need to know about like a hierarchy of values kind of start with the lightest light and the darkest dark. Now, neither of those will appear as they should if the painting is overpopulated with values that are similar, right? So just like I was saying, the white of the background robbed the highlight of its luminosity. As we darken the background everywhere, we remove everything that is white, essentially, from the painting. All of a sudden, this color value that's not even white appears to be brilliantly light. Now imagine if all the color values in her face were really, really light. What would we wind up with? We'd wind up with a highlight that didn't look that luminous. So I'm pushing all those values down, right? All those values, I'm adding color to them, keeping them chromatic and colorful and pushing them down in value to create the form of the head. And I'm even modeling a little bit. I'm even like tickling the surface just a little bit. Probably couldn't help myself just to make the this little area, the glabella, kind of turn downwards a little bit more. But it's also starting to become quite representational here. We're starting to see, if we kind of look back and forth, there's only a few really rough areas like the right-hand side of the face, for instance. I haven't given quite as much attention to the neck. I haven't given quite as much attention to. So there's definitely a couple of areas that are a little bit a little bit, you know, wobbly, but overall, I think we have a decently kind of blocked in painting here. Let's go ahead and get to another question. There's, by the way, of course, there's a lot, but maybe I need to go faster. Let me see if I can answer a couple questions faster. Elba Shimmer Kit says, I have two questions. The first one is, what are some exercises I can do to practice getting my sketches more anatomically correct? The second one is a question to you personally. Do you worry about color in the beginning of the planning process, like before the painting, or do you start worrying about that when you start painting? So the first one, if you want to get good at anatomy, you need to compartmentalize and just study anatomy. To study anatomy well, you need to have studied drawing first. So I would say actually, you know, and this is what I recommend to my students as well. When you're beginning studying, you need to understand the basics, the essentials of drawing, right? So we're not actually talking about like lofty things. Like when I was telling you that I learned anatomy really, really in depth, well past my 4th year of education, right? I started investing my own time and learning it rather than like taking a class to do it because there were problems that I couldn't solve that I needed to solve. So I think of anatomy as a little bit of a higher learning, right? Whereas like once you know how to model form, once you know how to discover proportions, once you know how to, you know, pass through the stages of a drawing in a rational way, once you know everything there is to know about your materials and stuff, I think at that point, anatomy becomes a great way to unlock some of the higher level like drawing questions. It's not to say that you can never utter the word anatomy until you've mastered drawing. I'm not saying that at all. That would be far too great a reduction of this. I'm just saying, like, if you want to study it in depth, I would say study it after you've learned to draw. Because why? Why do we even want to do that? We're not doctors, so I'm not learning anatomy so that I can point out anatomy. I'm learning anatomy so that I can draw it. And if I cannot draw, I'm highly unlikely to be able to assimilate what anatomy means in the world of drawing. So learn the method of drawing, then learn anatomy, because you'll be able to integrate it so much better into your drawing if you already have those techniques and those processes. The second question was, do I worry about color in the beginning of the painting, the beginning of the planning process? Absolutely. The color world that you're creating is arguably one of the most expressive aspects of what you're doing. And just because it's important and it's expressive doesn't mean it needs to be extreme. I don't need to, you know, have phthalo blue and cad orange deep right next to each other in order to have a color expression. You know, naturalistic color is its own expression, has its own kind of connotations. So yeah, I mean, it's absolutely a part of everything you do has to be a consideration of like what the color world that you want to work in is. Rodrigo Gons is just saying, hi, big fan. Thanks for sharing your process. No problem, Rodrigo. Choji says, I have a lot of trouble drawing stuff in perspective and that looks 3D and natural, especially bodies and portraits. What are your suggestions about how I can draw objects in spaces? Yeah, perspective is its own ball of wax, isn't it? Like, again, you know, much like anatomy, I feel like compartmentalization is a good place to start that. Although, unlike anatomy, I think perspective is probably, it goes into that beginning section of a kind of design education, right? I don't think you need to wait, you know, a couple of years to kind of get into anatomy, or sorry, to get into perspective. I think just understanding blocks, cubes, spheres, depth, those things are all going to be really, really useful to you in everything going forward. But it's its own kind of can of worms. So just seek out an instructor that gives you, how to put this, that makes the knowledge accessible to you, right? Now, depending upon your level, if you already know a bit about perspective, you could probably like deal with somebody who gives you really advanced knowledge about perspective. If you don't know anything about perspective, like jumping into the deep end is probably not going to be the most effective way to progress. I used to say this about like Bridgman's books. I love them. I think they're genius. Before I knew how to draw, I could barely get anything out of them because I just didn't. They were undecipherable to me. They were very complex. You know, finding somebody who gives you that knowledge in a simpler package, I think would be very useful. Kath asks, what do you think is the best approach for reliably being able to color pick, choose the right colors from reference pictures? This is a cool question. All of the color, how to put this? All the color learning that I did through studying from life. Not only studying from life, but studying in natural light. If you've ever had the opportunity to paint in a natural light studio, what you actually understand is that every cloud that goes by dramatically changes everything about how the model looks. I mean, I can remember, and by the way, remember I was saying, like, my model paintings would be 75 hours, 3 hours a day, 5 days a week for 5 weeks. So you would pass sometimes in between seasons in a way, during your model painting. Now that means that in the beginning of the painting, if you have a cloudy week, then you have like a really beautiful, warm, richly lit model. Then you have a day, or a week of like super clear skies. That's all that blue light coming in from the skylight, right? And that's going to cool off the model. So you're going to look at your red hot painting next to your ice cold looking model, and it's going to be a total freak out, right? Well, what you learn to do is adapt to that changing situation by understanding color context, which is basically, if you find the warmest and the coolest temperature, right? No matter what light is hitting the subject, or almost no matter what light is hitting the subject, the interrelationship of those two temperatures will remain roughly the same. So let's say if we have the warmest area on this model is the red of her lips, or let's be even more obvious. The warmest area in this model is going to be the red of her hair, and then the coolness of her cheek, just below her cheekbone on the left-hand side, that'll be the coolest temperature in her skin. That represents the ends of a spectrum. Now, if we look at another area like her cheek here, right? If we compare that to the redness of her hair, it's way cooler than that. It's not nearly as orange as her hair. But then we look over at that cool temperature under her cheekbone, and we find, well, it's warmer than that. So that's where it sits on the spectrum. So if this is super cold, this is super warm, I would say that, that color on the front of her cheek is maybe somewhere here. This is color context, and this is how you cope with both changing light, but also like understanding maybe color picking. I wouldn't say that even I would call it necessarily color picking, because it's almost that you need to like develop a color context in order to select good colors. Just as a for instance, if you have a painting that consists of several really incorrect color values, and you happen to color pick the perfect color and put it in the middle of them, it's going to look totally wrong because the context around it is not relevant to it, is not supporting it. So we need to develop a process that allows us to break down the color context by going from the broad to the specific. That's why when you saw me start out this painting, it was a big, broad, warm light shape, big, broad, warm shadow shape, right? By establishing the values really well and a generic color range, I was able to get a little bit more sophisticated in the way that I chose my colors subsequent to that. Let's see. Vogel asks, would these sketching techniques work with acrylics, with acrylic paint? I mean, I don't know. I haven't worked in acrylic paint since, I don't know, it's been many, many, many years since I ever did that. I mean, when you're painting, hue, value, and chroma don't change. Those three variables are all going to be essentially the same. So no matter what the picture is, if you're looking to reproduce accurate color values, it's going to be hue, value, chroma. So no matter what kind of paint you're using, it's essentially meant to express similar things. The process by which you go about it could be a little bit different, just because you don't have the range of oil paint, but you also don't have the constraints of oil paint that are, it's going to stay wet throughout the entire session. So whatever color is underneath is going to be picked up above it. There might be some things you don't have to do, because you can just repaint opaquely over the surface a dozen times during a 2-hour session. Here, I can't do that because once I set the overall temperature of the cheek being warm, I can't just turn 180 degrees on that. Alexander Wenger is asking, is it better to start a painting with a drawing in graphite or charcoal, or to draw with paint? If the latter one, which color is best to use? I think it's not really so much a best worst. I think that maybe if you added the equation of time into that. Yeah, well, all right. So to be fair, Alexander, the question you're asking, absent of a context, is a little bit difficult to answer. Is it better to do one or the other? Not really. I mean, if the result that you come to in the end is good and it's what you wanted, then why would I say that it's better to do a different way? That being said, I think that there is a very efficient way that you can handle the drawing process that can make you leap forward in oil paint. But that being said, I think oil paint responds really well to layers anyway. So I tend to do, like when I make an oil painting to make an oil painting, and I'm not going through a grisaille process, I'll make a block in raw umber usually. The reason it's raw umber is just because one, it's a very stable pigment, meaning it's a great lower layer of a painting pigment. It dries really fast, so usually like you want your lower layers of an oil painting to dry faster than the upper layers. And also like it's a good generic undertone for skin. Which, by the way, is a subject that goes back hundreds of years, and has, different philosophies about, there's the Verdaccio or whatever, where you're using like a green underpainting. There's a brunei, a grisaille. There's all sorts of different ways that you can make underpaintings, and that affects the color layers that you have subsequent to them. But you can just as easily like block that in paint. I guess it just depends upon kind of what your aims are and what your aptitudes are. If you really struggle drawing, I would say, yeah, definitely draw it first if you need to get a result. Jason asks, thoughts on Nicola Samori and the anti-art movement? Yeah, he makes really compelling work. I think it's really cool. I didn't know it was anti-art until just now. I think that there's room for everybody, and regardless of whether I'm into it, I love it, I hate it, whatever, I think there's a ton of room for it. Like I said, I think his work is really kind of interesting, and it's almost like you kind of need all types, just because you never know exactly where the right kind of influence is going to come from. I mean, I think that one of the things that I know, is asked a lot by students is about like style and about, how you get to have like the look of your work. I mean, really, it's remixing your influences. Like everybody sees work, and we're drawn to different kinds of work. Like when I was young, I loved Egon Schiele, but I was also a graffiti writer, and at the same time, strangely, somehow fit into that I thought Sargent was really great. So there's a lot of artists that I was like really into, and each one of them has a small bit to say about like the work that I make now. It's just a matter of like growing and gaining many influences and many insights, I think, and then eventually understanding how to combine them, which is why I believe so much in the use of mood boards, right? Which is essentially where you go and you kind of juxtapose a series of influences, a series of interests of yours. And through that juxtaposition, you attempt to understand what it is that you actually appreciate about all of them. Because let's just say, for instance, you like a work by Nicola Samori. I don't know if everybody knows his work. If you do, great. If you don't, whatever. But it's like these kind of classical looking portraits, and then there's like some paint ripped off it or braided or stabbed or scraped or whatever. So it's this combination of realism and destruction. Now, let's say that was on my mood board, and I had, strangely, a John Singer Sargent portrait next to it. I don't know what kind of, that's a totally bonkers mood board to start with. But anyway, the point is, you would look for what the red thread is between the two, right? Or if there is one. I think representation is a part of both. I think that there's a certain elegance in design that is similar to both. I think that, for instance, beauty or classical beauty would not necessarily be a connection in between the two. Sargent has a much more straightforward aesthetic, whereas Nicola Samori obviously is the face looking away from you. It's the mysterious. That's not exactly where Sargent's vibe was at. Um, so I think if you want to understanding for something for yourself about your influences, about what your artistic taste is, because I think that it's natural for students to really kind of wonder about this, like who am I as an artist, right? That's the big question. But I think there's a good way that we can take that out of here, out of the vague, empty space at the back of our mind, and put it like in front of us here. And we can really understand through that the nuts and bolts of our interests and of our influences, and then gain through that a sense of confidence and a sense of center about like where we want to be as artists, right? And then you can move towards that. Marriott Sota says, is it useful for fine artists to practice from memory? Totally. Every painting that you're going to do ever in your entire life is a memory exercise. The primary reason being is that we cannot look and paint at the same time. I have to look, memorize, and then transcribe, right? But I'm doing so based upon my memory. That's why things like anatomy actually I think are so interesting. Because what it does is it gives a name to what you're seeing. And when you name what you're seeing, you have a deeper, richer experience of it. Therefore, you have a stronger memory for it. So if I understand all of the things about the context of the body, it's much easier for me to understand, or rather to memorize, the location, form, shape, gesture of something as I'm putting it into my painting or into my drawing. Cat7Life says, I have a problem with painting. Every time when I sketch something to paint, the sketch comes better than the painting, and because of that, I always stick with just sketching and can't bring myself to paint because I think I'm going to ruin it. So this is actually a problem that Soroya, Joachim Soroya, Joaquin or Joachim? I think it ends in an N. Joaquin Soroya, the very famous, I think it was he Spanish or Catalan? He was Spanish, a Spanish painter. Said about oil painting was that to make a sketch and to keep it fresh and vibrant is not so difficult, but to do a painting that you have worked on for a dozen sessions and keep it fresh and vibrant, that is an incredible challenge. Now, one way or one way to understand the difference in between these two endeavors, right, is that what happens when you block in a painting, right? Everything is wet on wet. Now, oil paint is at its most efficient when it's wet on wet. You can move things around. You can create gradations and transitions. Like a lot of what oil paint wants to do is very easily accomplished when it's wet on wet. What happens usually when a student is going into the second session after the painting is dried completely is they're not really willing to repaint everything or to reactivate the painting. They tend to maybe kind of tickle away at things, which tends to degrade the sense of directness, freshness, and also contextual development, right? All of these first set of brushstrokes you developed in the same day, in the same set of observations and context. It's strong in a way because of that, right? Because everything's active. Now you take and you just tickle away at the cheek and you tickle away at the chin. These things are observed and painted, frankly, in a different context and can tend to break up or diminish a little bit the sense of wholeness or harmony in the painting. Now, as you practice more and more and more, you can get better at maintaining harmony while just working on smaller areas. But I think for beginning students, it can be a big problem. What I would say is probably just treat your painting each day as much as you can like a block-in. If you intend to paint it, then repaint it. If you intend to work on something, repaint it. Don't try to like save most of the painting and just tickle on one or two areas. Justin18 says, my question is, would it be bad to dive into color or a painting class before fully grasping shading with a pencil? Would it be bad? No. I don't think so, actually. Though I understand that like a linear trajectory like that can be very useful. There's also another school of thought which I think is very wise. Harold Speed talks about this in his book, The Practice and Science of Drawing. It's either that or his book on oil painting, one of the two. In any event, Harold Speed is known to have said that actually it's good to learn them parallel. Because by the time you're going to need to like make relevant oil painting, you need to know a little bit about how oil paint works. So getting some practice in is not a bad thing. Ibube Zulu asks, do you have any tips for coming back to an oil painting the next day and painting wet into dry? I find color matching and maintaining color harmony hard with the restart. Kind of relates to the question I just answered before. One of the things that you'll notice in this course in particular, on the one that's on Proko, that has 25% off today only, Bauman 25 at checkout. This course will show you one of the ways that I actually methodically go through and reactivate the right parts of the painting. Primarily, we're talking about reactivating the shadow edge, which is where a lot of your kind of transition is going to take place. So I tend to reactivate the shadow edge, reactivate the light shape either through a series of scumbles or through just repainting it. But in that way, you create a fresh painting without actually technically repainting every area of the picture. By the way, there's like a bunch of questions, and I know that we are coming up in 20 minutes on the 2-hour mark. By the way, looking at the painting, we really have something quite recognizable and quite recognizably different. Let's look at her mouth, by the way. Probably the weakest part of the painting for now. But what's developing is look at the cooler temperature around the lightest areas and the warmer temperatures in her cheek, the warmer temperatures in her hair. Look at the cool temperature in the center of the light shape of her neck on that left-hand side and how that is juxtaposed on either side with these warmer temperatures, right? Now remember, like temperature, color, and value have to correspond, right? Because eventually we need to make form out of this. So if you say like that you have the right color, it necessarily includes and means that you have the right value also. Because what happens? Let's take the color of her cheek on the right-hand side, this little sliver of light on her cheek on the right-hand side. Let's say I've painted that and it is 4 shades of value too dark. Well, what I would need to do to change that is I would have to add white to it, right? Now, white is going to naturally cool off the color simply by removing the or changing the proportion of colored pigments in the mixture, meaning that at the darker value, I could not have had the right color because there was not the appropriate mixture of things to create the color at the appropriate value. I'd have to add something else. So it's just, I bring this up because it's a common misconception that understanding of like how and color and value interact. You cannot have the right color unless you have the correct value also. Let's see. Wow, that's a tough one to pronounce. Prasenjik Basak says, what is the difference between warm color and cool color, and how does it make a difference in a picture that you are drawing? I'm going to take that as you mean painting. As I said earlier in the stream, when you're working with flesh tones, it's all about warm and cool temperatures. If you paint the figure and it's all 100% uniformly warm, it's going to look essentially like a mannequin or a doll. Why? Because our flesh is influenced by what tissues are kind of below the surface. You know, there are fatty tissues, there are blood vessels that are closer to the surface, there are veins, there's 100 different things like on your skin that actually causes it to be multicolored, right? Everybody, like, just for a minute, right? Just for a second, I imagine you're in a room where you can do this. Just look down at your hand. Look down at the back of your hand. I'm doing that now as well, right? And you see, you know, at least I see on my hand, like the blue of the veins. And I see, like, the warmth of, like, the suntan because it's Norwegian summer now. You know, and I can see, like, the way that the area of skin around my knuckles darkens a little bit. It's a little bit redder as well around there. And so I'm looking at all these different varieties of color within my skin, right? Now, why does temperature matter in skin? Because it's all temperature all the time. It's constantly varying. And you need to understand very well, I think, the interaction of warm and cool and how to, if not color pick, certainly to understand a color context and search for kind of outliers. Now, the way I do it is to look at the warmest and coolest temperature. Just in the same way with value, I'll look at the darkest and the lightest to understand what a midtone is. If you understand the warmest and the coolest, you can usually triangulate a little bit where the color temperature you're looking for actually is. Then mixing that on your palette, of course, is another issue. That comes to understanding the pigments on your palette and how they operate. Which, by the way, FYI, for oil painters and people studying oil paint, select a palette and stick with it for a while, right? One of the things that I used to do that in retrospect drives me crazy, like before I had an education in paint, was that I would constantly be changing the colors on my palette. Every day it was a new color, this, that. I would just squeeze out whatever I was using. And I never got to know any of my pigments really well. So they were like just like tools that I just was unfamiliar with. I didn't really know how to use them. I didn't really know what they were good for, what they weren't good for. Over time, you make a dozen paintings with the palette. You start to understand where that vermilion extra is perfect. You start to understand where you want to use alizarin to warm something up instead of vermilion. You know, these are insights that you need to gain with experience. So stick with the palette, at least for a little while, before you start adding, like chopping and changing. Let's see. Pre-project says, in your demo, I saw you immediately mix colors. Do you ever mix color in the beginning? I'm not totally certain that I understand the question. In your demo, I saw you immediately mix colors. Do you ever mix colors in the beginning? That sounds like the same thing. But yeah, I often, for most of my teaching, or pretty much all of my teaching, I do brush mixing. So I work with what is essentially an open palette. I just brush mix for whatever color value should be. You can also do pre-mixtures, which is a really, really useful way to kind of get used to understanding like how color and value operate and how your palette works. I teach this way because I think it's a little bit more immediate and it shows the thought process in a way that is more engaged with the actual painting that's being made. Whereas like pre-mixing, though great, is its own kind of process. You need to take about an hour before your painting session to just pre-mix all your colors. Vibrat Chatuvedi says, I started to find art more rewarding and feel of accomplishment and not as much what people describe as fun. Is it fine or do I need to change my mentality? Vibrat, take it easy because I think this aligns so much with what I feel about painting. I don't necessarily find painting fun. In the end, I find it very rewarding. It is a work that I do and I've become good at, and it took me a very long time to get there, a lot of struggle to get there. And I think that if I was searching for fun in painting, I'm not sure I would have been able to just go through the grind that it takes to really get good at it. So maybe it's semantic and we can say in the long term, the difference between something being fun and something being rewarding is just that it's long term. It's kind of a long-term fun, maybe. But I think I totally align with that. I think that it's just fine to quietly and steadily go about your work and attain gratification, not from what happens in the moment, but what happens kind of over time. Let's see. Rodri Golusa says, recently I started to like a lot paintings with an unfinished look to it. In the course, do you teach something like that related to the use of brush strokes? Well, what you're talking about there, the best way to categorize it is to refer to it as form sense. Now, this is an idea that was popularized by a teacher at the Art Students League in New York. I don't remember her name exactly. If you do, please shout out in the comments what it is. But she referred to this as form sense. And basically it was her way to describe how two paintings of apparently very different application can both look equally finished, right? Like if you look at, I bring up Sargent all the time. It's just an easy target. We all know what his work looks like. But if you took like a late period Sargent painting and an early period Rembrandt painting, right? They couldn't be any more different. It would be nearly impossible for them to be more different in terms of their actual technical expression, like how the paint got on the canvas and like what the paint looks like on the canvas. But they both look equally finished in a sense. Like the Sargent is harmonious and complete, and the Rembrandt is harmonious and complete. What they have essentially is two different form senses, which is to say, what does a finished painting in your world look like? Now, the good news is hue, value, chroma, and design, all these things stay exactly the same, essentially. Understanding hue, value, chroma, it doesn't matter if you want to render things to death in a hyper-realistic world, or you want to paint like you and you glow, where it's the simplest, biggest, broadest possible shapes that you could describe. Those two things are going to be virtually consistent in terms of like what your technical understanding needs to be to achieve that kind of form sense. Oh, and whether it's in my course, I mean, I'm not so much of like a bold, slashy, brushy painter. But there are studies that I do. Actually, I'm working on one right now, which, by the way, just FYI, we all know Sargent's painting of Lady Agnew of Lochnaw. There is a special offer right now on my Patreon to get access to the part 1 of my Lady Agnew of Lochnaw portrait course, which is a master study of Sargent. All you have to do is be a subscriber on the 13th of July, and that will be available to you. So yeah, whatever. You can check that out if you want to. If you don't want to, that's great. But that would be more what I offer in terms of like more brushy applications, just because I'm looking at the way Sargent simplified things into brush strokes and naturally trying to come to a similar conclusion as he did. Let's see. Overtown J says, speaking of bar drawing, did you ever follow up on Bernard Romain Julien? The previous Julien course. Unfortunately, like I've not actually had time for like side digressions. I've been really, really busy with the Atelier tier. It's absolutely a ton of work to get these lessons all together each month. So I haven't had time for that exactly, but who knows what the future holds. Avik asks, being colorblind, I can't do much differentiation in colors. So what's the best way to learn the fundamentals like temperature and value? If you cannot differentiate colors, I'm not sure how you're going to get to a place where you're able to understand temperature, because temperature is essentially synonymous with color, except usually it's contextual in the sense that we're talking about skin. So there's not usually like a red dot and a blue dot. It's more like an orange dot and a less orange dot that we're trying to differentiate. So I'm not sure. Value, however, should be pretty even across the board. So painting, I think a lot of grisailles would be good. I think that also if I'm just going to take a guess out of the air as to what would be really useful, the consistency of your palette, I think, would be key. Because I also know that there's a lot of different kinds of color blindness. Like my father-in-law has particular insensitivity to red. So things that are red appear to him to be like a deep brown. So he can't really recognize that part of the spectrum. So for him, I think like choosing maybe 1, maybe 2 reds on his palette and then using them very consistently over time to see like how they harmonize with other colors would be maybe the best way to bridge the gap in between what he can see and what his painting would actually look like. But that's the best guess that I have. Sagnik Kirtan says, sir, I love your work. Many students like me who really love art can't progress due to financial problems, and there are many countries like India where there are no such prominent art institutions who are focused on teaching classical art. Most of us have to depend on YouTube, but you might know it is really not enough. So what do you think students like us should do? At the risk of, I mean, I don't want to say like what's expensive or what's not expensive. I can say that my Patreon is $10 a month and is relatively comprehensive, certainly for that amount. I think that there's a lot of ways now where you can. I think artists are a lot more open and a lot more accessible, and I think that if $10 a month is not an obstacle to you, I think that there are really actually multiple options available to you. But again, even if $10 is expensive, I know every budget is different. If that's the case, I think that you probably have to go to probably the search of old texts from which you can derive some answers. But again, a lot of teaching is really like, it's very visual and it's very experiential, and it's very different depending on like what stage of the education you're in. So I think between YouTube and like artists like myself that like have their own like teaching pages that are really low cost, I think those are the solutions you probably have to look at. Lucas Aiello says, have you ever approached more fantastical portraits like monsters or fairies or stuff like that? How would you approach the creation and mix of references to make it? I've never really gone down that road. I mean, I don't really have a lot of experience in it. Not to say I don't love it. I mean, actually, there's a lot of, a lot of the work that I like, I think is from artists that can work in that way. I mean, well, maybe not a lot, but like certainly there are artists like Tomer Hanuka, if you know him or his work. Like, I would say that he has some more fantastical aspects to it that I think are really interesting. If I had to approach it in my work, I think that I would tend to be very referential, and I would also probably tend to prepare a lot of things on Photoshop first. Even when I'm doing like strictly quite representational work, as something like this, I'll probably Photoshop it to start as well, just to make sure I have the right color shift in the background, the right value shift in the background. If there's something from a design perspective that's really bothering me that I don't want to be a part of the final painting, like I'll work on that beforehand for sure. Iroots asks, how do you achieve a painterly look without having the piece look unfinished, especially for digital art? I think you got to look back at that kind of form sense, and basically establish what your end point is. I think also that, again, you don't need to be like a lone wolf, have your inspirational references on hand while you're working. There's a reason I used to like tape, different portraits by different artists on my easel while I'm working. Because I want to see, there was something about that finish that resonated with me. Am I going past that? Am I fussing with something that doesn't relate to this, that is my goal? If so, then it's a kind of a guide a little bit in the dark, right? It's a lantern, in the dark or whatever. Laurel Beam asks, I have a little question about brushes. You had mentioned you don't use turpentine whatsoever. Is that environmental? More so, I can't believe your brushes are really clean with only dishwashing liquid. Do you spend a long time cleaning? Is it due to the quality of your brush? It's not the quality of the brush. I don't spend a long time cleaning. And yeah, I mean, Murphy's oil soap, which is not exactly dish fluid, but also like strong dish fluids, really they're made to cut oil, and they cut oil enough that you can get your brushes clean without too much fuss. I don't use spirits or things in my work, partly because like this is my career, and I've already spent probably almost 20 years in art studios, and over that amount of time, oh, by the way, I'm putting that brush stroke into the eyelid that probably everybody's been waiting for. I know I was waiting a long time to do it, but it's just popped in. It's not environmental, it's more like physical, but it happens to have, a knock-on effect that I don't, have to dispose of a lot of mineral spirits into the environment. Sam asks, how do you know when a painting is finished? Usually I tend to rely on my enthusiasm. So like I said earlier in the live stream, with paintings and painters, like there's not a lot of room for, like in the professional world, right? Forget about being a student. The professional world, there's not a lot of room for average or mediocre artwork, which means that you need to be like dialed in 100%, I think, if you're gonna operate at the highest level and make work that is valuable. With that in mind, you're a great barometer, right? Like I know when I come into the studio if I'm red hot on fire to work on a painting. If I'm not, I'll tend to wait for the next day. Maybe I'll do some Photoshop tweaking to it just to see like, oh, what if I did this? What if I did that? I need to refresh my ideas a little bit. Now that's not to say I'm waiting for inspiration, but I'm just not going to work if I don't feel like I have productive work in me. On that, maybe I'll paint on something else, start a different project that you are feeling enthusiasm for. Because I feel like I can circle back to painting sometimes. My enthusiasm does return, but I can't force it also. Virginia Windsor asks, you mentioned a brownish yellow in place of yellow ochre. Could you share your preference for a brand or specific color name? That is, by the way, in the lesson notes for this course, the classical portraiture techniques and concepts, there is a full list of that. But I'll just hit you guys in 5 seconds here. Ivory black, alizarin crimson, vermilion extra, yellow brown, which is only made by Old Holland, and flake white. That's the palette. Cat Aquarelle asks, you show various approaches to oil painting, from painting over PVA size, drawing, to jumping into painting on a blank canvas, like in this demo. What is your preferred method these days? My preferred method these days. Cat, it's a fair question. And pinned down to say what my preferred method is, I have to just tell you that it's whichever one works for the project that I'm working on. Right now, I'm like making this like above life-size head. It's probably like a 1.5 life-size. And so naturally I have to work a little bit more indirectly with that, because just given the space that it has, like Alaprime is just not going to work for me to get the result that I want to get. So a lot of times it's more about where I want it to be at the end, like how I choose to kind of go about it. Yeah. KLM says, I'm having trouble seeing what colors actually are in flesh, so I never achieve subtle transitions and tones. All my portraits look too graphic. I'm tempted to concentrate on landscapes. I don't have access to live models. What do you suggest I can do to improve photographic references? Hey, the internet is out there, and a lot of artists release model packs, not least of which I do it. Both on Proko, I have a model pack associated with this lesson. I have tons of model packs on my Patreon as well. Just get good references from artists whose artwork has an aesthetic that you want to follow, and practice with those. I know that, by the way, I've got to announce, I probably have to announce now who the random winner is, so that all of you don't get annoyed that I haven't done it yet. But I'm going to do one more question, then I'm going to announce who it is. So Shushup says, question 1, how to handle multiple brushes in the hand during an oil painting when you are working with multiple values. What color can be a limited palette, but still covering secondary color like orange, purple, magenta, etc.? And question 3, is it a good idea to use painting as a reference photo? All right, so the first one, handling multiple brushes, a lot of ways to do it. You just kind of want to keep one brush size and one brush shape per light and dark value. In general, you know, especially for students, I would say that it's practical to not mix so much your light and dark colors with your brush. I do it sometimes because, again, you know, I practiced for a very long time, and you can manage to paint the whole painting with one brush if you really wanted to. But for students, that can contribute to a lot of kind of muddy color. So I would say there's a lot of different things you can get. There's like, I have like this clip on the side of my easel that has like 2 little tubes on the side of it, and I can just chuck my brushes in there that I don't feel like holding at the time. The next one, what color can be on a limited palette? Really, anything can be a limited palette. This is the fascinating thing about it. Here's the deal. Let me tell you that limited palettes are not something less than a maximal palette. What you're doing when you choose a limited palette, which by the way can consist of anything. You can have cad red, cad yellow, and viridian and white. That's a limited palette. You can make a painting with that. But what you're doing is you're selecting your color world, right? Ultimately, color in a painting is a massively expressive feature, and it contributes so directly to the feeling, the vibe that people are going to get off your painting. If you arbitrarily choose a series of 10 colors, what you're doing is you're kind of falling at the first hurdle of expression, right? Select the colors that suit the vibe that you want in your painting. So there's a reason why right now I'm painting with phthalo turquoise on my palette. It's not because it's a convenient blue to use, but I know that it has an edge to it that I want to tint my colors with that ultramarine or cobalt wouldn't give me. So choosing the colors that you have on your palette, limited or not, is a deeply artistic process, meaning that it contributes massively to the effect that you're able to achieve in the end. Can you have a limited palette that has secondary colors in it also? I mean, technically you can. I mean, whether you want to call it limited at that point, I don't know. But if you feel the need for your expressive ends to have orange, purple, magenta, etc., then you should. By the way, your limited palette should also shift based upon the subject matter that you're painting. Like for me, a lot of the stuff that I teach is very classical, very traditional, very atelier based. So like we'll go through like still life painting, right? You're not going to paint a lemon with yellow ochre. It's just not going to arrive. I mean, you can try and do it, and people have tried to do it, but eventually it just looks like a really old, like dead, dried up lemon instead of a bright, vibrant cadmium lemon yellow lemon. So you need to adjust to your subject matter. If you can't achieve what your subject matter is with your palette, you got to change it. All right, so there's 3 or 4 more questions, but also we're at that moment where I'm going to announce who the random winner is. This is a question I answered a while back, but it's Jason, spelled J-S-U-N. You are today's winner. John is informing me on Slack here that he has already added it to your account on Proko.com. So you now have access already to this lesson, classical, portraits, concept. I've been talking for 2 hours. Classical portraiture techniques and concepts. Or is it concepts and techniques? Point is, you have access to that lesson already. So congrats. Cheers to you, Jason. And by the way, just checking in on the painting, right? We went a long way to get to this place. I think what I discovered when I was making this painting was actually that it was going to eventually be a lot warmer than I suspected. I thought that there was going to be like a lot more kind of divergent temperature, but it seems that as you get like out to the periphery of the form, like on the forehead, on the cheek, on the jaw, that all these are relatively warm turns. But that those cool temperatures were going to exist on a slightly oblique but light-facing plane. If you look at the side of the neck, if you look at the side of the forehead here, that's where you're getting your kind of cool temperatures. And as that goes into the kind of outer edge, the upper outer edge or rim of the eye socket, that's where we're getting cool temperatures. The only, cool color that I have technically on my palette here is ivory black. So that's about as cold as I can get, meaning that the overall vibe in the painting is pretty warm. But by the way, just look at the temperature of the background on the right-hand side versus the temperatures in her skin. There's a massive divergence there in terms of like cold background, warm flesh tones. So that was another thing that I thought was pretty cool to kind of achieve in this one. Also, the hair was a lot more yellow-orange than I expected. I thought I would find a lot more red-orange, but I was really dipping a lot into my yellow-brown to kind of get to this place. So also something a little bit unexpected there as well. Let's see. I think, like I said, maybe there's a couple more questions here. N. Yigi asks, is there a reason you're using a wood palette instead of a gray palette for your paint? There is, but it's just totally preference. I mean, optimally, right, to recognize color, you want to have like a neutral gray palette. However, though, even that, which is the most non-choice that you can take, is still going to have an effect. Like gray, though neutral, is a lot cooler than a lot of flesh tone mixtures. So what happens when you paint on a really cool palette is that your cool temperatures on that palette look a lot warmer than they are, right? Because they're in a cool context. And then when you take them off your palette and put it onto your painting, they're like way too cold. Now, the same thing can happen with a warm palette in reverse. Your warm temperatures don't look quite as warm as they are, so you put them into your painting, they're way warmer than they should be. With practice, you can learn to detect how your pigments and your paints will behave and what the context of your painting is. So eventually, it doesn't matter as much what you do with your palette choice. So for me, it's just I like a wood palette. Just my preference. Another person is asking, can you have style of values or are values organized by your style of painting? Keying your painting, whether you're keying it quite dark or keying it quite light, you could say that is kind of a stylistic choice. That being said, like if you're strictly making representational work and just kind of expressing form beyond the whole context of your painting, it's difficult to say that values are a style. I mean, maybe, I mean, Lucian Freud, maybe the way he used values, but again, I don't think of his work as strictly very representational. I think that it's highly stylized. Um, uh, I'm not a pretty big fan of Freud, but that's just me. But so in that way, like, yeah, I guess they are a style. Yeah, hope that answers your question. Uh, Lucas Aiello is asking, you seem to get your drawings to a very refined, realistic state. What do you think about artists like Fetchin or even contemporary WLOP and what they do with implying things with simple brushstrokes? Does it take being able to do what you do and then get more abstract, or can you study directly to learn that? I think I've painted a lot of different ways in my time. Like I did for a long time paint very directly and yeah, with very clear brushstrokes. Eventually, I decide that's not exactly the aesthetic that I'm after, and so you know I've changed to suit what I really wanted to do. Um, I think Fetchin's amazing. Like, I mean, what's not great about Nikolai Fetchin? Um, you know, his form sense, his whole world is so well built. You know, it's hard to argue with anything that he does. So I think it's great. I mean, you can study more direct and then become more refined. That's true. However, I would just add the caveat that the way that you study is likely to be the way that you will paint in the end. Let's see. Felicia Negru says, you mentioned you don't use solvent to clean your brushes, but only clean them with soap. So I assume at the end. So how do you deal with that during a painting session to avoid color value contamination? I just dip my brush into a little bit of linseed oil in the cup and then just take away as much of the pigment as I can. If I need to really make a dramatic shift, like I've got phthalo turquoise in my brush, and I need to move that over to like a high key vermilion mixture, I'll actually do kind of a color wash. So I'll use a bit of oil, I'll mix it out, I'll put my brush actually into a bit of alizarin, which is gonna like shift the phthalo towards a warmer temperature, and I'll take away that as much as I can, and then dip into the vermilion and white. I know that seems like a little bit crazy to do, but if I'm painting with just a couple of brushes, which sometimes I actually really prefer to do, that's the method that I use to kind of get that done. Is it a perfect one? Not really, but it works in practice. Let's see. I think this is one of like the last questions, and that is appropriate. John asks, what part of your usual process might be considered unconventional or expected to other painters, if any? Well, I guess it depends upon which other painters you're asking. I mean, you know, the cool thing about different schools of painting, and I kind of mentioned this a little bit in the beginning, was that everybody's got like one part of the story. And like each part is fascinating. I think each part on its own is just fascinating. Looking at the different schools that you can go to, you know, where I studied, you know, looking at where Stan studied, and you know, like all the online places that you can learn. They all have like something that they're particularly kind of good at. As it happens, like I taught at, you know, an atelier for about 12 years or so. And what you tend to find is that a lot of them are very I want to be fair about this, but I'm going to be honest about this. There are some who do not live in like a multiplistic universe where many different solutions, you know, can be used to kind of get to a place. They prefer to simplify and say it's only this way. I've never been of that feeling. I kind of like to use a little bit of what everybody does. So if you asked my former colleagues at the Florence Academy, like, what do I do now that would seem controversial to them? Probably blocking in a head using a complete linear wireframe based on centerline construction would be massively controversial to them. They would go like, what do you mean? That's not what I see on the model, you know? Whereas, I don't know, if you went and asked somebody that was, I don't know, I mean, I didn't really learn that at a school. I just kind of put it together myself. But I imagine there's a lot of influences from like, from Russian or more constructive drawing that are taking place in that, or people that are, deeply in on Loomis, that would make a ton of sense to them. It wouldn't be controversial at all. So I guess it really just, it's just the crowd you're asking. Um, And then maybe I think of phthalo turquoise as a bit of a controversial color to add into like the palette that I use. I tend to use this really simplified, super limited palette, and then like popping phthalo turquoise in there is like, I don't know, it's like bringing a gun to a knife fight. It's like explosive. Um, so that's maybe what's controversial. But by the way, people, this is it. These are the absolute last brush strokes. The highlight on the lip. I think it's going to be probably the last thing that I add, and that's the color study I was able to make in about 3 or 4 hours. Now, we can ask the question: is it perfect? No. Is it amazing? Probably not. But did I gain a valuable experience from going through this process that is going to inform things that I do down the road when I'm making that much more refined painting? Oh my goodness, yes. Like all the assumptions that I had, now I've taken through a trial of proving them. So when I go to make my finished painting, which I made as a tutorial, like at the end of a 3-part tutorial, so there was zero room for error in that painting. I needed to know where it needed to go, and I needed to know the tools that I needed to use on the way. That's what I got out of painting this. And that's why these color studies, these sketches, if you think about what they can give you in 4 hours of painting, I guarantee you that they will shave off 10 hours in your final painting process. That's why I do them when I feel like I'm really pressed for performance. But I just want to say, by the way, to everybody, think about this. If you had any enjoyment watching this, there's an entire course on Proko.com that is dedicated to going through all the stages of portraiture, as I understand them, going through a rendered graphite drawing, going through a grisaille painting, and going through a full color painting. That entire course is available on Proko.com. It's on sale today for 25% off. The code is Bauman25. I'm going to put that on the screen right now. If you go to Proko.com/Stephen Bauman, that's where my instructor page is. And just for today, you can get this lesson for 25% off. I want to say thank you in the background to John Birchall, who is the Proko guy that I'm working with on this stream today. So thank you, John. And thank you, everybody, for just showing up and like asking a whole ton of questions and hopefully having a really good time on the stream with me. But that's all from me. I'm signing off, everybody.